Hey everyone, welcome back to Strange Minds 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we're going to be getting into a new book called Strange Things Are Happening in Creepers. Mirror Mirror by Edgar J. Hyde. This is a series of books. I have here the Mirror Mirror one, I have The Grave Digger, I have The Scarecrow, Dr. Death, and Cold Kisser. But we're going to start with Mirror Mirror. But before we begin, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And without further ado, my dear friends, grab a snack, grab a drink, or sit back and relax. And let's get to it. Chapter 1: The Ballerina. Sophie stood transfixed. The doll, wearing the silver sparkling dress, twirled gracefully on her stand. To her, the doll was utterly magical, and she decided then and there that she had to have it. She would not leave the store that day without the ballerina. From the corner of her eye, she looked at her mother and father. They were both deep in conversation with the owner of the store, an elderly man named Mr. Larson, whom Sophie had known since she had first come to the shop as a little girl with her parents and two older sisters. Her eldest sister, Maya, had perched on top of a pile of orange crates in the corner, pensively staring out of the window. Sophie shuddered when she looked at Maya. This could be there could be spiders as big as your arm inside those crates. Not that they would scare Maya. She wasn't afraid of things like that. Sophie's eyes left Maya and traveled to where Danny sat, head bowed, as always, devouring every word of every book she could get her hands on. Sophie herself had never understood this attraction to words that her middle sister had, although she enjoyed reading enough for a 7-year-old. She preferred instead to stare at the glossy magazines in the checkout lanes at the grocery store. Sophie suddenly became aware that at least she, already thought of it as hers, ballerina was no longer moving. The music had stopped, so Sophie bent forward to pick up the box and restart the music. Mr. and Mrs. Molina had decided to enter the store after seeing the beautiful mirror with a golden frame hanging above the long store counter. Mrs. Molina was so taken back by the mirror's beauty, she had gasped aloud. Her husband had been a little more non-committal until he had checked the price tag, but upon finding it was within their price range, he agreed with his wife that it would look very nice above the fireplace of their newly decorated study. "Come on, girls," said Mrs. Molina. Said Mr. Molina. "It's time to leave." Maya and Danny joined their parents as they said their goodbyes to Mr. Lawson. "I'll have it delivered the day after tomorrow," he said. "That'll give you enough time to decide exactly where you're going to hang it." he laughed. Mrs. Melina turned and walked toward where Sophie still stood. "What's this?" her mom said with a smile. It was like Sophie to become fixated on the prettiest thing in the store. "Mom," Sophie said as she looked up into her mother's eyes, "I promise I'll give my allowance forever if I can just have this ballerina." Mrs. Molina hid her smile as she lifted the little music box to check for the price. Forever, thought Mrs. Molina. What rash promises kids will make, all for a $5 music box. That was the price, scrawled in large blue letters on the card attached to the foot of the ballerina. Mrs. Molina looked at her husband. He smiled and shrugged his shoulders before ruffling Sophie's hair. "Go ahead and get it, sweetie, but I think maybe 1 week without allowance would be long enough." "Thank you! You've made me the happiest girl in the whole world," shouted Sophie. "I'll take such good care of her, I promise." Sophie was breathless with the excitement of it all and practically ran to the counter to watch Mr. Lawson wrap her treasure. "Well, ain't that a coincidence?" said Mr. Lawson as he picked up the little box. "This here music box came from the same place as the mirror your mom and dad just bought. Good taste you've got in this family, eh?" The Molinas listened to what the old man had to go and say, and looked interested enough in the history of the mirror. They had heard his stories before, stories that they felt were embellished with just enough romance and danger as to entice potential customers into parting with their money. Not that they doubted there wasn't at least an element of truth in what Mr. Lawson said. It was just that he tended to stretch the truth a little sometimes. "Seen a lot, that mirror," he'd said earlier, and now he said the same thing of the little ballerina. I wonder what stories she'd tell if she could only speak. He winked at Sophie, and he finished wrapping the box in tissue paper. Sophie smiled back at Mr. Lawson and curtsied. She'd read somewhere that it was very ladylike for a girl to curtsy. She then took the box from the old man and thanked him graciously before joining her sisters at the door of the shop. "Should have been born 300 years ago, that one," Mr. Lawson said with a smile. Mrs. Molina smiled back as she surveyed her 3 daughters. How, she thought to herself for the millionth time, was it possible to have 3 children so utterly different from one another? Maya was 14 years old, and in her freshman year of high school. She'd been blessed with good looks and long, gorgeous hair in perfect condition. She then looked toward Danny. Danny spent every waking hour and even some when she should have been sleeping, with her head bent over whatever book she was currently reading. And Sophie, pretty, angelic, little Sophie, well, maybe not so angelic sometimes. Her lips looked pinker than normal, and she couldn't quite tell if it was the natural dark color of her eyelashes that made them look so long today, or if the little girl had helped herself to her mascara. She decided to look into that little matter when they got home. The Molina family left the antique shop having said their final goodbyes to Mr. Lawson, amid promises of a Tuesday delivery. "I'm glad we stopped in there," Mr. Molina said to his wife as he started the car. "Now let's go home and have lunch." As the car climbed the hill on the last leg of the journey, Oatlands, the family's home, came into view. Maya found their house absolutely breathtaking. The house had been built over 200 years ago, and though seemingly imposing, Maya thought it always looked friendly and welcoming as you approached. At this point, the Molina family did not use all the rooms of Oatlands, having only moved into the house 3 months earlier. Mrs. Molina was in no rush with the decor. Better to wait and buy exactly what you want rather than rushing and getting it all wrong, she was fond of saying. Maya loved to explore, and though she had spent most of her spare time since they moved here doing just that, she felt sure there were still parts of the house she hadn't been in. Mr. Molina had barely stopped the car when Maya opened the door and got out. "And just where do you think you're going?" Mrs. Molina asked Danny. Since she had been too late in asking the same question to Maya, who was by now out of the earshot, Danny paused, one leg already half out of the car. "I just have to finish the chapter I was reading this morning, Mom, and then I'll find out what happened to Julianne." "I was at a really crucial point when you called me downstairs and I couldn't concentrate in the store. Please, Mom, just half an hour, then I'll come and help make lunch." Danny smiled winningly at her mother. Danny had a smile that could charm the birds off the trees, and it worked on Mrs. Molina every time. "Go on, then," she sighed. "Maybe the next time you're at the library, you could get some cookbooks, if you're as interested in the subject as everything else. Who knows, I may even get a break from the kitchen." Mr. Molina got out of the car and helped Sophie unfasten her seatbelt. "Lunch will be ready in about an hour, so come down when you're called, Sophie," Mrs. Molina said. "Okay, Mom," replied Sophie with a smile. She then stood on her tiptoes to kiss her mother. "And thanks again. This is the best present ever." She turned toward her father, kissed him too, and climbed the stairs to her room. Chapter 2. Behind the Mirror. "Where on earth is the first aid kit?" asked Mrs. Molina, to no one in particular. Mr. Molina had apparently cut his finger on the corner of the new mirror. It had been delivered as promised on Tuesday, and Mr. Molina had spent most of the week trying to hang it on the wall above the fireplace. Eventually, after a lot of banging, taking down, muttering, and some looks from his wife, he had managed to get the mirror hanging in just the right spot on Saturday. On his way down the ladder, however, he had snagged his thumb on a jagged part of the frame surrounding the mirror, hence the search for the first aid kit. Mrs. Molina came out of the kitchen carrying the thought-to-be-missing kit and proceeded into the study where her injured husband sat, feeling very sorry for himself. She wiped his finger and applied a bandage. She also complimented him, telling him what an amazing job he had done hanging the mirror. A few minutes later, a bandaged Mr. Molina was smiling again. His wife knew that his ego only needed flattering before he would be back to his normal self. He practically strutted around the room, turning from every corner to see what the mirror looked like from that angle. "Yes, it does look pretty good up there, if I do say so myself," he said, as if he had made the whole mirror rather than just hanging it from a nail in the wall. Mrs. Molina, however, knew when to keep quiet and merely mumbled her agreement. "Once we're actually using the room, maybe we can buy wall lights. If we put them at a certain angle, it would make the mirror really pop," said Mr. Molina. "Yes, dear," agreed his wife as she ushered him out of the room. "But that's after we have the chimney swept. Get the gas hooked up and pick out a suitable grate for the fireplace. I'm afraid there's a lot left to do to that room before we can start using it." The three girls entered the study, and they, too, had admired the mirror. It really was quite imposing hanging there. Though little Sophie was too small to see her reflection unless she stood on her tiptoes. "Come on, you two," said Maya. "There is much to see and do, and so little time to do it all." Danny, book tucked under her arm, followed her older sister from the room. Not that she was going to do any exploring outside, or exploring chapter 9 in her book. That left Sophie alone in the room. She soon worked out that if she sat on the top of her father's leather-covered desk, she could see herself in the mirror. Today she was wearing crimson-tied nail polish. Her mother had said she could wear bright colors when she wasn't in school, and she had spent the better part of the morning applying this particular bright color to her tiny but perfectly shaped fingernails. She picked up a glossy magazine and started to read from the terrific hair tips page. She carefully positioned her fingers so that she could see the tiny little red nails glint back at her from the mirror. She decided to read aloud. She had watched fascinated at her Sunday school teacher read to the class each Sunday. Her long nails curled around the book. Before long she reached for her little music box, the ballerina now restored to her former glory. Sophie had painted the little doll's lips and tiny little fingertips with one of her nail polishes. She wound up the box and placed it beside her on the desk. And as the music began to play, she returned to reading the Coloring Commandments section of the article. She was wondering how her mother would react if Sophie were to dye some of her curls purple, when all of a sudden she thought she felt someone watching her. She looked up, thinking she would see only her own reflection, and was horrified to see not her own face, but that of an older girl in the mirror. Sophie sat very still and blinked hard, then turned her head quickly to look behind her. There was no one else in the room. The ballerina just turned gracefully to the music, however, lending an air of complete unreality to the whole scene. Sophie tried to get off the desk and go and get her parents or her sister, but before she could do so, the girl in the mirror turned her eyes away from Sophie to look at another scene that was unfolding behind her. Terrified, Sophie could not take her eyes away from the mirror, nor could she get off the desk. Her eyes followed the girl's, and the scene before her in the mirror completely changed. There was thousands upon thousands of people, all jostling and pushing for a place in the crowd. Sophie saw a large wooden construction, some sort of scaffolding, which was draped entirely in black cloth and strewn with a straw. A lady approached the scaffolding, a young and beautiful lady, accompanied by 4 attendants. In her hands the woman clutched a prayer book, and as she approached the scaffolding, she turned and gave the book to one of her attendants. The 4 women were weeping, and Sophie could sense the fear in the atmosphere. The crowd was becoming agitated now, jeering and shouting, fists punching the air, children being lifted onto shoulders. The beautiful lady, her hair bound high, knelt at the block of the scaffolding and unclasped her necklace. A hooded man spoke briefly to the lady and knelt to retrieve his hidden axe from the straw and raised it over the woman's head. Sophie covered her eyes when she realized what was about to happen. She couldn't help but glance at the young girl in the mirror and thought she saw tears on her eyes too. Sophie screamed and no longer frozen to the desk. She jumped down and fled the study as quickly as her young legs would allow. "Mom, Dad, anyone, help, help!" she shouted as she ran along the hallway. She almost jumped out of her skin when she bumped into Maya, who had just come from the kitchen. "Whoa, Sophie, what's gotten into you?" Maya clasped the young girl firmly by the shoulders. "Calm down and tell me, what is this all about?" "Maya, it was horrible. There was a man in a hood. He had an axe. They were glad she died. And a little girl, she was so sad. I think she was crying too." "Hold on, Sophie. Just hold on. Were you watching a scary movie? Because if you were, I'm telling Mom. You know those give you nightmares." "It wasn't a movie, Maya. Please don't yell at me. I didn't do anything wrong. It was the mirror. I was just looking in the mirror and something horrible happened. I don't understand it, but I'm scared." By this time, Danny had appeared and stopped to find out what all the commotion was about. "Come on, Sophie. Come into the kitchen and sit down. Maybe if you calm down a little, you can tell us exactly what happened." Danny took her little sister by the hand and led her into the comfort of the warm kitchen. The 3 sisters sat around the table. "Okay, Sophie, start at the beginning, and maybe we can figure this whole thing out," said Maya, and so she did. The 2 older girls looked at one another. "If I didn't know any better, I'd say you've been reading up on some history." Henry VIII or something, said Danny. It sounds just like what happened when one of his wives was being beheaded. Beheaded? Wailed Sophie. Maya dug Danny hard in the ribs. Don't scare her any more than she already is, she chided her sister. Come on, Sophie. Let's go back to the study and see what we can find. Sophie was aghast. I can't go back in there. Please, Maya, don't make me go back into that study. It's too scary. Please, I'll do anything you say. Just don't make me go back into that room. Maya placed an arm around her young sister's shoulder. I won't make you do anything you don't want to. Don't worry. Danny and I will go. You stay here and we'll be right back. Sophie wiped her eyes, forgetting for a moment the eyeshadow she had so carefully applied that morning, which she had now smeared all over her tear-stained face. Where are Mom and Dad? She asked. They just left to go to the grocery store and run some other errands. Maybe it's for the best. We don't really want them seeing you this upset until we know exactly what's going on. Danny poured her little sister a glass of milk and put 2 chocolate chip cookies on a plate for her. After having made sure that she was all right to be left alone for a few minutes, the 2 older sisters left the kitchen and made their way towards the study. Maya pushed open the door. The 2 girls were greeted by silence. The smell of old leather and a general air of peace. Danny bent over and picked up her little sister's music box from where it had fallen on the floor. Look, she must have dropped it when she ran from the room, Danny said. Maya nodded. She must have really been scared if she left her ballerina behind. Maya walked toward the mirror, looking for any clues as to what had taken place in the study only minutes before. The mirror looked like a regular mirror to her. She stood on her tippy toes and touched around the edges, trying to feel if there could possibly be something behind it. She turned away from the mirror, then turned back quickly to look at her reflection. She only saw her own face staring back at her. I feel a little silly doing this, she thought, shaking her head. She didn't want to dislodge the mirror from its place on the wall. After all, the trouble her father had get it to hang just right. She turned to Danny to see if she had found anything when she spotted something lying on the carpet just in front of where they stood. She bent closer and saw that there was a few pieces of straw with tiny spots of blood splattered on them. There's no way, she told herself, picking up the straw and stuffing it quickly into the pocket of her jeans. Danny turned and asked, What did you say? Maya was unaware she had spoken out loud. Nothing, nothing. Danny, I just think we're wasting our time here. Doesn't seem like there's anything to find, so let's go back to Sophie in the kitchen. Maya, for the time being, didn't want her younger sister seeing what she had just found, not until she had more time to examine it at least. Come on, she said, leading the way out of the room. Let's go, she said, as she pushed the straw deeper into her pocket, then turned back to face her younger sister. Danny, sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to yell at you or anything. I mean, I know you're well read and all that, but I really don't think it's a good idea to plant ideas like that into Sophie's head. She's too young to learn about all that stuff. I know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, replied Danny. It's just that, honestly, Maya, it really felt like she could have been describing a scene straight from a history book. I mean, Anne Boleyn died in exactly that way. She had 4 ladies in waiting with her, and her executioner looked just like Sophie described. Maya shivered involuntarily. Okay, Danny, I hear what you're saying, but now you're scaring me. Please don't say anything else about this to Sophie. I want to believe her, but I think she must have imagined the whole thing. She has a piece of straw with blood. Really? She must have just seen something on TV that scared her, and for some reason she thought of it again when she was in the study. Danny took the magazine from her sister, pushed open the kitchen door, and went to comfort her younger sister as best as she knew how. Maya once again pushed the pieces of straw deep into her pocket and took a deep breath. She wasn't ready to share what she had found, but she had a sinking feeling that there may actually be something going on with that mirror. Where's that music box, Sophie? She said. Sophie's words were still indistinguishable from sobs, and she couldn't answer. You must have been scared to leave that behind. Don't let it get away from you, Maya said as she pulled it from behind her back. Chapter 3. Aunt Camilla. And this is where we are going to stop, my dear friends. Tune in next time to hear Chapter 3 and to see what's going on with that mirror. This has been Ruby, signing off, my dear friends.